When I started in college in 1964, we had to worry about the draft. I had a cousin at the time who had just joined the Navy, and he'd gone through officer candidate school, and he came up to visit me in Cambridge. And he came in his brand new blue uniform with the gold buttons, and we decided to take a walk, and we were going to go to lunch in Harvard Square. And I noticed that as we walked around the square, all the good-looking young ladies were looking at him in that, gorgeous blue suit with the gold buttons. And I said, I think that's what I would like to do. During the time I was in ROTC, every summer, of course, we had to go off on summer camp. And each summer was an opportunity to experience a different part of the Navy. So between freshman and sophomore years, I was assigned to a World War II era destroyer. And I spent those 6 weeks puking my guts out. The next summer, between sophomore and junior years, they sent us down to Little Creek, Virginia to pretend that we were Marines. And I said, I don't think I want to be a Marine. And then between my junior and senior years, somebody came along and said, hey, we need volunteers for a submarine cruise. There was very little room for extra crew, especially the midshipmen, so I slept on top of a torpedo. The next few weeks, I went aboard a nuclear-powered submarine. So they shut the hatch and we dove, and we didn't come to the surface for 5 weeks. While I was underneath the water for 5 weeks, I decided submarines are not for me. So when it came time to choose what I really wanted to do, I tried everything but aviation. So I said, what the hell? And I signed up to be a naval aviator. The Navy, in training their aviators, trains everybody to be more than just an aviator. So they sent me to Naval Justice School, and I spent 8 weeks becoming a certified Navy lawyer. Every officer who was going overseas was required to go through a school called SERE, S-E-R-E, which stands for Survival, Escape, Resistance, and Evasion. I flew to San Diego. I got off the plane. I reported to SERE school. And the second day I was there, they gave me a set of fatigues and a survival knife and a book of matches. And they took about 30 of us on a bus out to the Warner Springs desert area outside of San Diego along the Mexican border, and led us out and said, okay, if you can go from this point and navigate yourself to that point about 5 miles away, you will successfully have completed the training. But if you got captured during the time you were trying to evade across those 5 miles, and oh, by the way, the system was rigged, everybody got captured because they had people hiding everywhere, you were hauled out and sent to a mock POW camp. They rounded all of us up eventually and dragged us into this camp. They threw us into tiger cages. They took us out. They interrogated us. They beat the crap out of us. They deprived us of food and water for days at a time. And it was obviously a psychological evaluation more than anything else. Now, what they didn't tell us was that if you flunked out of this camp, you wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. They hauled us all out at 5 o'clock one morning and took us to the parade ground and lined us all up. And the camp commandant came out, who was actual ex-North Vietnamese, and he told all of us, he said, now you are all going to stand here and you are going to salute my flag as we run it up the flagpole. And we're going, oh shit, another indignity. So they broke out the flag and they ran it up the flagpole, and it was the Stars and Stripes. There wasn't anyone who didn't break down. So after that exercise, I finally got to get to my first squadron, which was VF 96, Fighter Squadron 96 aboard the USS Constellation. And I joined them as they were out in the South China Sea. I was flying F-4 Phantoms, the most fun you can have with your clothes on. I've got my name on the cockpit along with my guy in back, decked out in the correct designations. And as an officer aboard ship in the air wing, we had our own wardroom, which is where the officers gathered for their daily meals or to just hang out. Every time you went into the wardroom, you had to appear in uniform, and you would sit down at a table with white linen and nice china and real silver and be served your meals. And then after that, you'd run back to the ready room and don your grubby flight suit and jump into a plane and go drop some bombs, and hopefully you didn't get shot down or wounded or killed. Come back and put your whites on, go to dinner with your fine china and white linen and silverware. Only once in a while, the guy that you had been sitting next to at lunch was no longer there at dinner. And the steward would come over and roll up his napkin, put it in the napkin ring, collect his silverware, and take it away, because he was no longer there. I flew 262 combat missions over the course of 3 tours. I only lost 1 plane. We were flying cover for a group of A-4 attack aircraft. They had the tough job of, flying in low and dropping the bombs, and we were flying high cover for them at about 5,000 feet. They had briefed us that there were supposed to be 4 SAM sites in the area. There were actually 8. Each of those was capable of firing between 10 and 12 SAM-2 missiles. And one of the missiles went by the cockpit. It was like watching a telephone pole fly by your cockpit. But there was another one right behind it, and it took off the tail hook. It blew through my port engine, which immediately caught fire, and it ripped off the right landing gear. Some pieces of the missile came through the bottom of the aircraft. One piece clipped the bottom of my seat, came up and hit me in the chin. I have a scar right here. It went up inside my helmet and buzzed around. And all of a sudden, my world turned red. Blood was pouring down the inside of my visor, and I didn't know what had happened to the guy in back. You didn't know if he was dead or alive. And I gave half a thought to reaching up and pulling the ejection handle, and fortunately at that moment I realized I'm over North Vietnam. I don't know what the guy in back's condition is, because if I punch out, he goes too. We were only 30 miles from the beach, and I said, if I can get out over the water. I did manage to get out, and for some strange reason, the air currents pushed me right up another several hundred feet, and the engine that was really screaming started running perfectly. And I said, crap, I might be able to get back to the ship. So I radioed ahead, and I told him to clear the pattern. I'm coming in. I have no tailhook. I have no landing gear. So they rigged the barrier, and I flew the airplane over the fantail, and I passed out. And the plane hit the flight deck and apparently skidded right into the net, which is what I hoped it would do, and they pulled the 2 of us out. Now, the guy in back didn't have a scratch. He had hit his head on the side of the canopy, and he was knocked out. I could have killed him. While I was recuperating and getting back on flight status, they had sent me back to Hawaii. I had a classmate whose family owned the Honolulu Advertiser newspaper. And he said, hey, why don't you write a couple articles for us, talk about your experiences. I wrote a series of 3 articles talking about what it meant to me to go through the ROTC experience. After the 3rd article was published, I went to work, I guess, 2-3 days later, and my commanding officer at the time said to me, Lieutenant, what the fuck have you done now? So, I don't know, sir, what do you mean? And he said, I just got a call from Admiral McCain's chief of staff. Now, Admiral John McCain, the father of Senator McCain, at that time was commander-in-chief of all the military forces in the Pacific. I reported for duty at the Admiral's office the next morning. And in comes this guy about yay tall. He was a really short guy. And he's got 4 big silver stars on each collar, and he's smoking a giant cigar. And he looks at me and he goes, "Are you Keith?" And I snapped to attention. I said, "Yes, sir." He stuck out his hand and he said, "I love what you wrote in that newspaper. How'd you like to be on my staff?" "What would you like me to do, sir?" He said, "I want you to be my flag secretary." Well, I soon found out that a flag secretary, at least for Admiral McCain, makes sure that no matter where he goes, he's got a full box of cigars and a case of Dewar's. The most meaningful day I ever spent with him, though, was one in which we were actually in Saigon. After the meetings were over, he came to me and said, "Son, get me a Huey. Where do we want to go?" He said, "I want to go to the DMZ." I said, "Okay." So he flew right up to the edge of the DMZ, found a LZ and put it down. And the Admiral said to me, and he said, "Wait here." So he stood there looking across the DMZ for 15 minutes. And then he turned around and came back and he said, "Okay, let's go." I finally said, "Admiral, do you mind if I ask you what was that all about?" He said, "I was just talking with my son." His son was obviously a POW in Hanoi, and that was as close as he could get to him. The last 14 years of my time in the Navy, I was actually a designated intel officer. I had a couple of interesting assignments, one as a temporary duty officer with the CIA, and it was right when George H.W. Bush was director of the CIA, so I got a chance to meet him. Very fine gentleman. In my last assignment, the Navy has this tradition that if you've done reasonably well and you haven't screwed up too badly, they'll give you what's called a sunset tour. So I became commanding officer of the Pacific Fleet Training Command. Have short hours, you're going to have plenty of time to play golf. And I said, great. And I got there and I had 1,100 people working for me and an $80 million budget, and I never worked so hard in my life. In 2008, realizing that if I was ever going to write anything, I better hurry up because I was getting on. One of the very first things I did was I took a short seminar from a fellow who has now become a very dear friend, a local well-known author by the name of Tom Clavin. And he said, well, the best thing you can do at this point is to write what you know. On the front page of the Times, down in the lower right-hand corner, here's a picture of these guys. And they're, gray-haired like me. And the headline was something to the effect, Vietnam vets to receive prestigious award. And I said, wow, this is a great story. Maybe I should write this one. But as I was interviewing them, oh yeah, it was a hell of a fight. Yeah, we remember that one. That was good. But you should have seen the mess we got into the week after this. So that's how the first 2 Vietnam books came to be. These kids today, they face a whole raft of challenges. I mean, I served 3 combat tours. I mean, there are kids coming back after 10. I just can't imagine what that stress level is like. But don't be a hero. Don't hesitate to ask for help would be the main message. In fact, I've given that message to several.